When the worship of God is central, that's why a place like this, by the way, is so important, where people gather stubbornly in season and out to worship God. That's why Thomas Merton said, when he went to Gethsemane for the first time, I found the still point around which the whole country revolves without knowing it. That's deeply patristic insight. Adam and Eve, so prior to the fall, produce around them this well-ordered society. The church fathers recovered the rabbis who said the purpose of the human race is now to Edenize the world, is to turn the whole world into a beautiful garden centered around the right praise of God. That means the flourishing of all things human centered on the praise of God. The original sin on this symbolic reading interrupted this vocation. So what did God do? God formed a people, Israel, and He shaped them according to His own mind and heart. They would think as He thinks, feel as He feels. He taught them how to worship Him aright. Again, what's the purpose? That Israel, in its right praise, would now become the gathering place of the whole world. Mount Zion, true pole of the earth. There all the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. The right praise of Israel would become itself a new Eden. That's why the temple in Jerusalem was decorated with the symbols of the garden. And all the tribes of the world would come there and be Edenized. Israelitized, if you want. Now, Israel fell into sin. But there comes at the climax of history the true Israelite, whom Paul importantly named the new Adam, right? The new Adam, the new human. Jesus, the true Israelite, who gives the Father perfect praise, becomes himself the Garden of Eden. What does he gather around himself? He gathers around himself a mystical body, which is his church. And now the church, which Paul calls the new Israel, is meant again to be the magnetic gathering place of the world. All the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. That's the church's mission now, is to Edenize, Israelitize, use Vatican II language now, Christify the world. See, I'm going to argue, everybody, that's Vatican II. Vatican II is not about modernizing the church. Some modernization was called for, yes indeed. But the purpose of Vatican II was not to modernize the church, it was to Christify the world. That's why the joys and hopes and sorrows and anxieties of the world are the joys and hopes and anxieties of the church. Because the church has this transformative mission within the world. That's Vatican II. That's why Cardinal George, who gave the last lecture in this series, has said, Vatican II is best construed as a missionary council. Quite right, it seems to me. A missionary council. That's the beginning of Gaudium et Spes. There's a book that Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote. Balthasar, of course, was not at Vatican II for a lot of reasons, but he was very influential at Vatican II through a number of his disciples. He wrote a book in the 50s called Schleifung der Bastionen in his German. It means the knocking down of the bastions. Now, do you see why, in light of what I've been describing? Balthasar's complaint was the church, in all of its richness, theological, spiritual, moral, cultural, was crouching behind walls, crouching behind its own medieval walls, preventing it from flooding the world with Christ's life. Therefore, knock down the bastions in order to Christify the world. That, it seems to me, is Gaudium et Spes. Now, here's where the critics are going to lock horns with each other. This is where the disagreement comes in. And everybody, I can witness to this. I know when I told you I graduated in 1977, you were probably calculating, how old is this guy? I'm 53, I'll tell you. I came of age right after Vatican II. So I went to first grade in 1965. My early formation was 60s and 70s of the last century. Making myself sound terribly old. How was Vatican II read? At least now, this is my own experience. I think that of a lot of people in my generation. It was read as the modernization of the church. That the world the modern world, is setting the agenda for the church. That, by the way, was a motto, a slogan of the time when I was a kid. That's a terrible slogan in my judgment. The world does not set the agenda for the church. Rather, the church transfigures the world with Christ. Yes, it goes out to it with love and the joys and hopes and anxieties of it are the church's own. Yes, indeed. But it doesn't go, listen, hat in hand to the culture, trying to make ourselves acceptable to the modern culture. Modern culture, like every culture, is evangelically ambiguous. But again, I'll witness to my own upbringing. Culture was like just a good term when I was a kid. The culture was good, and the church has got to make itself more like the culture. It's got to accommodate itself to the culture. Tell a black person in Alabama circa 1950 that the church's job is to become like the culture. Tell a Jew in Germany of the 30s, that the job of the church is to become like the culture. Our culture, modern culture, good? Sure. I can give you a whole lecture on the great achievements of modern culture, especially in politics and science. But unambiguously good? Come on. Our abortion on demand culture. Look at the streets of Chicago. The violence in our culture, the moral drift, the culture of relativism, the dictatorship of relativism, as Benedict XVI put it. No, we don't come hat in hand to this deeply ambiguous modern culture seeking to accommodate ourselves. No. The church, it's the new Adam, the new Israel. It's Christ's mystical body going out now to transfigure the world. That, it seems to me, is the proper dialogic relationship between the church and the modern world. Here's something from Karl Barth I've always loved. Barth, arguably the greatest Protestant theologian of the last century. And Barth, as a young man, was deeply anti-Catholic. But as an old man, he had mellowed quite a bit, and Paul VI invited him to the Vatican II, the final sessions. Barth came. Here's this deeply anti-Catholic, at one time, Protestant theologian, who said, if the Holy Spirit's moving anywhere in the Christian world today, it's moving in the Catholic Church. So deeply moved by Vatican II. He came at the end, though, to an audience with Paul VI. Thanked the Pope for the great experience. Then he asked a question, though. He said, Holy Father, when will you know the church is sufficiently updated? Now, he's playing with the term of the time, right? Aggiornamento, updating. But it was a question with a sting in its tail. He was teasingly asking the Pope, are you perhaps allowing the modern world to become the measure of the church and not vice versa? See, I think, everybody, that's where the critics are locking horns on Gaudium et Spes. I think you can give it a very coherent reading, as I've been suggesting. Coming up out of this patristic background, it's about Christifying the world, not so much modernizing the church. Listen to a couple quotes here. The church has the duty in every age of examining the signs of the times and interpreting them in light of the gospel. Again, when I was coming of age, the signs of the times, that was always good. The signs of the times. And the church should get in line with the signs of the times. 23 people killed in the streets of Chicago, that's a sign of the times. How many millions of unborn killed since Roe v. Wade? That's a sign of our time. The moral drift that's everywhere in our culture. Young people being lost, a newly aggressive atheism. Those are all signs of the time. Our job is not to accommodate ourselves to those, but rather, again, listen, to read the signs of the times, both good and bad, and interpret them in light of the gospel. The signs of the times are not themselves the data of revelation. They're the data of examination. And the church's job is to read them in light of the gospel and rightly interpret them. That's Gaudium et Spes. Listen to this. It is accordingly in the light of Christ, who is the image of the invisible God, that the council proposes to elucidate the mystery of humankind. That's it. I'm going to argue that's de Lubac, that's Danielu, that's Congar, that's Ratzinger. It's not working the other way. See, watch it again. It's in light of Christ, the image of the invisible God, that the council proposes to elucidate the mystery of mankind. That's, I think, the way Gaudium et Spes works.